David is one of the finest analysts on a wide variety of topics that you could ask for. He's the award-winning founder and director of Alternative Radio, and if you're not familiar with it, it's an independent weekly radio program, usually lectures, tapes of fine lectures, speakers that you would love to hear. Locally, it's on KALW, that's 91.7 FM, every Monday from 1 to 2 p.m. Highly recommend you check it out, or check out his website where you can catch up with these, and that's alternativeradio.org. David is one of America's most wide-ranging and respected independent journalists, and he's really kind of altered the media landscape with his radio programs and his many books written with the likes of Noam Chomsky, Tariq Ali, Howard Zinn, Edward Said, Arundhati Roy, and many others. And a lot of those books are right here tonight, and David would be glad to sign them and sell them to you afterwards. It's one of the things that helps support his work. He's the winner of the Media Education Award, the ACLU's Upton Sinclair Award for Independent Journalism, and the Cultural Freedom Fellowship from the Lannan Foundation. The Institute for Alternative Journalism named him one of its top 10 media heroes, and he's certainly one of my top 10 media heroes. Please welcome David Barsamian.
Well, good evening, brothers and sisters in Palo Alto. It's wonderful to see your smiling faces here on this Wednesday evening. Thanks for turning out, and thanks to the Peninsula Peace and Justice Center for making this evening possible. You know, it always reminds me of the famous quote attributed to Margaret Mead about never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has. And you're very lucky to have such an organization here in your community. I can think of lots of places across the United States and Canada as well, where I've been spending a lot of time recently, where there is no Peninsula Peace and Justice Center, and people are kind of left to their own devices. And it's kind of important in this time of just enormous corporate concentration and power and the growth of a massive surveillance state that we commune, that we connect. You know, there's the epigraph to the E.M. Forster novel, Howard's End, only connect. It's so important to overcome isolation and atomization, because that's one of the ways they can kind of marginalize us and keep us absorbing a kind of sense of powerlessness, that we're all alone, that we can't make a difference. In other words, fulfill your duty as a citizen and make shopping choices. That's where you can, really exercise your democratic prerogatives, and you can have fierce debates about, well, should I get a Honda or a Prius or a Tesla or this or that car? It's so important to engage, and so I'm going to be in San Francisco tomorrow at the Public Library at 6, but you'll be here in this community, and there's lots of work to do. One of the things that I learned from one of my mentors, the great historian Howard Zinn, was to use humor during presentations. So if occasionally you may hear some commentary that's a bit unorthodox. For example, hey, NSA, who you going to spy on and in what way? Hey, TSA, who you going to pull over at the airport today? Lies, fill up agency files. UAVs rain death from the skies. Pilotless drones will blow out your eyes. Government agents, look out. Here comes the FBI, IEDs, RPGs, WMDs, CIA, NSC, DHS, DEA. There goes the USA. There goes the USA. Now, the great poet, songwriter Leonard Cohen of Canada wrote a song in the mid-'70s called Democracy is Coming to the USA. And I can see that some of you remember that. It was an affirmative statement that it was coming to the USA. I think if you were to write that song today, you might be thinking about putting a question mark at the end of it because of what's been happening to the democracy in a very systematic and sustained way over the last 3 or 4 decades. Now, I'm wearing a T-shirt tonight that says, "Don't trust the corporate media." And I think it's a bit misleading because in many ways you can trust the corporate media to lie, to fabricate, to distort, to invent, and completely misrepresent reality. We have now 5 corporations that basically control what most Americans see, hear, and read. There are major mergers. I mean, there's even going to be more concentration. AT&T is now proposing to take over DirecTV. Comcast wants to take over Time Warner Cable. We're always told that when these mergers take place, it'll be good for the consumer. There'll be, although how, if there's less competition, it will be good for the consumer is not clear at all. And we're told also that, of course, prices are going to come down because there'll be more market efficiency. There won't be redundancy of services and things like that. Well, if you believe fairy tales like that, which maybe are taught in, Cal and Stanford economics departments, but are not verified in the real world. If you believe those kinds of stories, then please see me about maybe getting some of that beachfront property that I own in Boulder at the end of this evening. Now, the media do perform a societal function, and it's very important for power elites in terms of manufacturing consent. I think no one better than Noam Chomsky has written and talked about this over many years. But the media also serve as a weapon of mass distraction. So, you hear about WMDs, but the real WMDs really consist of what MSNBC, NBC, CBS, ABC, CNN, and Fox, and the other networks are able to produce in terms of dumbing down the American people and focusing on a whole culture of distractions and focus on celebrity-itis. So Lady Gaga's latest concert or her magnificent hairdo, what's happening with Miley Cyrus and Katy Perry, Justin Bieber, is he going to be arrested again in Southern California, Lindsay Lohan in and out of rehab clinics. But don't forget the Kardashian sisters, please, a really important topic, which is the endless talk shows on TV are talking about this and that, let's say, body adjustment that one of the sisters has gotten. You might know from my name that I'm Armenian, and I promised my mother before she died I would always mention an Armenian name in my public talk. So, Mom, if you're listening, I just did my duty. The Kardashians, which would be the correct Armenian pronunciation, are in fact are Armenian. But what about the press corps? And I use that carefully. I know enough Sanskrit to know it's press corps. What are they doing in terms of being lapdogs with laptops, really practicing a kind of prostitution? Not really journalism, not investigative, not challenging the embedded ideas that are just cascading from the mouths of people in power. And it comes in very high relief in probably the media that we all partake in and listen to and watch. I'm talking about National Public Radio's morning edition. That would be MOURNING. We should be wearing black, as I often do when I listen, or Some Things Considered in the afternoon. Or, Charlie Rose, the News Hour on PBS. These are very sophisticated programs. People are very polite. They seem to have a command of English grammar. They still know how to use adverbs, for example, correctly, and prepositions are in the right place. But, essentially, they are just constantly rolling over the same tropes about American foreign policy. It's benign, it has good intentions, occasionally it makes mistakes. Capitalism, not really a problem. Here and there are bad apples like Bernie Madoff and Raj Rajaratnam, but we'll go after them, and there's never any analysis or look at systems and institutions of power. So it's much more, in a different way, also celebrity-itis, focusing on those people in the public limelight who have fallen afoul, let's say, of the law. Now, I think what we need, obviously, are investigative journalists who are able to challenge the dominant discourse that is laid out in the corporate media. And there's a quote from Milton that actually was used in the film and the book Manufacturing Consent that Chomsky wrote with Ed Herman in 1987, 1988. Those who put out the people's eyes reproach them for their blindness. Those who put out the people's eyes reproach them of their blindness. And we have a media system that is essentially keeping people uninformed on one hand, with the celebrities and the Hollywood stuff and the divorces and the sports and all of that. And then you have the elite media, the New York Times, which I read, the Wall Street Journal, which I try to read, other business magazines where you could really learn a lot about what's going on, because people in the business world need absolute facts and information that are accurate. The propaganda is for everybody else about what a great system we have here. Now, I think traditionally people on the left are full of gloom and doom. I hope I'm not conveying that, but there is some cause for some good news, let us say. And I just want to review a couple of things that have happened just in the last couple of months. For example, the election of a woman from South Asia, of Indian origin, to the Seattle City Council, Kshama Sawant, on the Socialist Party ticket. This is the first election in the United States in decades of anyone on the socialist ticket to be successful. So that's a very, I think, hopefully a promise of things to come, because socialism has been systematically denigrated, and the good name of socialism and its reputation. I'm not talking about the Soviet Union, which was an aberration and which really besmirched the good name of socialism. Howard Zinn once said that one of the greatest disasters that ever befell socialism is when the Soviet Union appropriated that title into the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. So we need to revive an idea of collectivity and collective action. And I think in addressing the climate crises, multiple crises, and the ecological calamities that are not far off. I come from a state, Colorado, which this time last year was undergoing a record drought. That was punctuated by record forest fires. That was followed by unprecedented flooding, and now we're back to drought conditions again. And I believe in California, I don't have to remind you about the water situation here or the fires that are just starting. And the predictions are that this summer will be, according to the U.S. Forest Service, particularly in the western states, there will be huge numbers of fires, and it'll be very difficult to contain because of the aridity. So looking at the climate crisis, can individual countries or communities really address what needs to be done in order to, first of all, arrest the deterioration of the climate, the increasing temperatures, but also then to restore and nurture Mother Nature. There is a war on nature. There is a war on Pachamama, on Mother Earth, on Gaia, on Putri Bhumi, whatever you want to call her, but our pale blue dot in the universe is in enormous peril. And it's really shocking that the political and economic system really refuses to come to terms with what is happening. And everything is pushed down the road. There's climate summit after climate summit. There was one in Warsaw in December. The next one's going to be in Paris. They started in Copenhagen and then Durban and Rio and on and on. And what do these climate summits accomplish? Well, they accomplish photo ops for these, great leaders that supposedly represent us, who then proclaim that they're completely devoted to the environment, they're green, and then they have a group photograph, all smiling, and then they're drinking their Chardonnay or Cabernet Sauvignon or whatever, and then they go back to their countries and it's business as usual, because they're completely unable and unwilling to address the crisis at hand. But I went off a little bit from this tangent of some good news that I think you should. Well, it's hard, but let me read to you something. I wonder if you can recognize this. What Marxist-Leninist activist scholar said this: "Today, everything comes under the laws of competition and the survival of the fittest, where the powerful feed upon the powerless. As a consequence, masses of people find themselves excluded and marginalized, without work, without possibilities, without any means of escape. The idea that a free market will inevitably succeed in bringing about greater justice and inclusiveness in the world has never been confirmed by the facts." Now, what great activist said this? Any guesses out there? Pope Francis. Very recently in Rome, actually on the occasion of the rehabilitation of a very important Catholic priest from Peru, who was purged in the 1980s by the sainted, venerated Pope John II, who sent out Benedict to literally get all of these radical priests who were practicing liberation theology. I'm talking about Gustavo Gutierrez, who's not a household name in the US, but someone who is very, very significant in terms of the liberation theology movement. So he was invited back to Rome and is now being kind of given prominence, and that kind of philosophy is again taking hold in the Vatican. I think it's better to have the Pope on our side than their side. In terms of the local economy and some changes that we've seen, particularly since the crash of 2007, 2008, and in case you missed it, the Obama administration announced in 2009 that the recovery is in full swing, and it is. The recovery is in full swing. 95% of all the profits in the last 5 or 6 years have gone to the 1%. So there's been a modicum of recovery. Many more people, of course, are working part-time jobs, 2 jobs, 3 jobs, or don't have work at all. More even have dropped out of the job market altogether. I know I'm speaking here in Silicon Valley. It's an area of enormous privilege and wealth. It seems like every other car that I see is a BMW or an Audi or a Mercedes. But there is a lot happening out in the countryside, and I think you're aware of it. But I think also that we need to focus on some of the good things that are happening in the economy, kind of outside the mainstream, and that is this enormous explosion of co-ops. I don't know if you have any here in Palo Alto, but Goral Perovitz has been the one who's been really highlighting this issue and talking about it. There's been thousands and thousands of co-ops, and because we don't, that are growing all over the country, but because we really don't have a national, radical progressive media, they're not given much attention. Or if there's a story by Diane Sawyer, it disappears because it only comes up once and in every 3 or 4 months, and it doesn't really reach any kind of critical consciousness. But I was interested to learn when I was walking in the Mission last year, looking up and seeing a signboard of a cafe bakery that said worker and owner operated. So I went in, and it turned out to be the Arimendes bakery and cafe. There are 6 of these in the Bay Area, and they're worker-owned and cooperative, and they're sharing of profits, and they take their name significantly from the Spanish priest in the Basque Country in 1956 who started the Mondragon cooperative. Again, in this time of economic dislocation and catastrophe, Mondragon really held firm. They didn't lose workers. They didn't, they didn't lay people off. You might know that Spain has a terrible economic situation. There's something like 20 to 25% unemployment. But Mondragon has 80,000 workers. It started with just a handful, and it is the 7th largest enterprise in all of Spain. And an interesting thing about Mondragon, and maybe it accounts for its success and that we could emulate, is that there is not a wide disparity from the workers, let's say in the field or on the shop floor, and management. It's around maybe 5 or 6 to 1. In the United States, as you know, income inequality and wealth inequality is enormous, and the salary differences are often 100 times, 200 times, 500 times, even in some instances 1,000 times more than the average worker. And so people who work in Mondragon, who work in Spain, feel a certain, not just ownership of the enterprise, but they don't feel this class resentment, against the bosses, against the managers who are earning, not very much more than they are earning. And that's one of the things, of course, that has skyrocketed here in our country, particularly since the Reagan period, is just an enormous growth in inequality, and I'll be returning to that topic as well. So check out the Arimendes bakeries and cafes in the Bay Area. Did you know that Land of Lakes Butter is a cooperative? Ace Hardware? I mean, I just found these things out. Nationwide Insurance. There's cab companies that are organized, like in Madison, Wisconsin. There's a carpenter. I haven't been able to find out his name. I think it's Joseph, and he has an Irish last name, in the Bay Area, who's organized other building trade workers to form a worker-run cooperative. So if you need a carpenter or a mason or a plumber, you can call this group, and they'll come and do the work. So that is kind of happening sub rosa, underneath everything else. There's been the growth of the boycott, sanctions, and divestment movement. There's also been in Portland, for example, Portland, Oregon, became the first city just a couple of days ago to get rid of its Walmart bonds. It's divesting from Walmart. So kind of putting its money where its values are. The city council voted to do that. There have been fracking ordinances passed all over the country by a very aroused citizenry, and this really crosses across left, right, Dem, liberal, conservative, Tea Party, Republicans, because mothers and fathers care whether their kids are drinking clean water or not, or are getting nutritious food. And so ordinances have been passed, implemented in various communities. I don't know about, in this area, is fracking an issue? I'm asking. In Santa Cruz, it's an issue. In the last couple of days. Yeah. So it's a huge nationwide issue. And why has there been this kind of juggernaut behind fracking, which goes under some really bad expletives too under fracking. But Obama has declared that America will be energy independent, and he's crowing about this. They're now talking about Saudi America by 2015, which is just like a year away. The U.S. will be energy independent. I'll read you, if I can find his quote, in which he thinks this is an absolutely great thing. 100 years of energy independent as we become the Saudi Arabia of the next century, very likely the final century of human civilization if current policies persist. Obama didn't say that. That's Noam Chomsky. Okay, so now this is what he's quoting from Obama. Now, under my administration, America is producing more oil today than at any time in the preceding 8 years. Over the last 3 years, I've directed my administration to open up millions of acres for gas and oil exploration across 23 states. We are opening up more than millions of acres for gas and oil exploration. We've quadrupled the number of operating rigs to a record high. We've added enough new oil and gas pipelines to circle the earth and then some. Well, that's our president's a vision of eco-sanity. One might say eco-insanity. Yes, we'll be energy independent, but what are we doing to the environment? And this is a curious thing about capitalism and the economic system. The environment is considered an externality. It's something that someone else has to deal with. So if I'm, in Waltham, Massachusetts, and have a Samsonite factory, and I'm pumping chemicals into the nearby river, this is an actual incident, by the way. If you've read the great book and seen the film A Civil Action, that's what this is about. And that river gets polluted and because of the toxic chemicals that have been put into it by my company. And there's a sudden skyrocketing of cancer in that community. Well, that's an externality. Insurance companies will pay, people will go to the emergency room. It's not my responsibility. What happens to the environment is not something that is of great import to the owners and operators of these mostly large corporations. So we have to consider the consequences of what is being proposed in terms of achieving this goal of energy independence. And this also brings in the whole issue of the tar sands in northern Alberta. The Keystone XL pipeline, which has now been put on hold. The State Department has decided not to make a decision on it until after the November elections. Now, you may be thinking, well, these people really have, our concerns, at heart, and care about the environment. I hate to sound cynical, but I am from New York, as you couldn't tell. 4 Obama Democratic senators are in states where the pipeline is being proposed, and they are in danger of being defeated. So they can come out and say, yes, we want the pipeline between now and November, and then afterwards they can, probably sign off on it. But if that happens, and have any of you been to northern Alberta? I mean, it's an amazing place. You've seen the film Avatar? That's what it looks like. This massive earth-moving equipment. I mean, the tires on these trucks are just like they're half the size of this room. They're just absolutely enormous and mind-boggling. And so it's the filthiest oil on earth. It's a combination of, it kind of smells like molasses and in a very toxic kind of mix. And there's a proposal to export the tar sands oil to China. There's pipelines that are being built or proposed in Canada just in case the U.S. does not approve the Keystone XL pipeline to get the oil out to China. Now, there's a great movement of mostly indigenous women in Canada called Idle No More. They call them First Nations, by the way, the Native Americans, the First Nations there, who have been able to block a number of these pipelines, particularly in British Columbia. So it seems that there's a fundamental difference between how the administration and the law regards indigenous peoples in Canada versus the U.S., because they do have treaties that are juridically binding, and they have a lot more teeth in them than treaties that the U.S. has signed here with Native Americans. So that's a very positive development in Canada, the growth of Idle No More, a movement that began in Manitoba, actually, in the Winnipeg area, and is now spread all across the country. Now, again, the tar sands, just to quote Jim Hansen, who was the veteran NASA scientist who recently retired so that he could speak out more forcefully on these particular issues. He's the one, by the way, in 1987 or 88, testified for the first time in public to a congressional committee that there was something happening with the climate. And it wasn't good. There was a definite trajectory toward warmer, higher and higher temperatures, which will result in sea levels rising, and this could be a real problem down the road. Well, he says if the tar sands, if that project goes through, it will be essentially game over. It will be the tipping point. You know, we keep hearing about this term, this is a tipping point, that is a tipping point. You know, it's hard to say what it will be, but according to this very respected scientist and others as well, they believe that in fact this will be that kind of tipping point. Some other good news, bad news. You see, I'm not a systematic kind of speaker, but I was, really glad that Pierre Omidyar gave $250 million. He's the, you know who he is? He's the French-born Iranian-American, the founder of eBay. He put $250 million into a new media project called First Look Media. You can read about what they're doing on the net at The Intercept. Just put in The Intercept, and he made some initial hires, which are pretty exciting, and people like Jeremy Scahill and Glenn Greenwald, Laura Poitras, most recently Matt Taibbi from Rolling Stone has signed up. Some of the best investigative journalists here in the United States to cover the issues that need to be covered and uncovered as well. And so that's really exciting. And, hats off to Edward Snowden and what he did. He's been honored with the Ridenhour Prize. And, of course, Chelsea Manning remains in jail. Secretary of State Kerry has revoked Snowden's passport, so he's unable to travel, which I think is an absolute shame. And if Obama had any real moral courage, he might think about giving the Nobel Prize that he got to Edward Snowden, someone who really did something that deserves it and has really enriched the democracy and has exposed the surveillance state in all of its many multifaceted forms. So it's good we still have people like that, people of conscience, whistleblowers. Now, again, probably most of us voted for Obama. It's under the Obama administration that more people have been prosecuted and jailed under the Alien and Sedition Act than all the previous administrations combined since around 1920, when that law was enacted. People are being muzzled. People who speak out, who see corruption, who see waste and fraud and illegal activity, which is what Snowden saw, are not being encouraged, in fact, are being discouraged and are being prosecuted. I think that's a huge blow for democracy, because we need those people. We need those green shoots in the garden to flourish, to blossom, so that we can find out what's really going on. So that's I think, not to the credit of the Obama administration and the John Holder Justice Department. Now, as I said, I always like to use humor, and recently, talking about the Ukraine, I thought I'd bring the Ukraine in here, because Obama said that Russia seems to believe that in the Ukraine, big nations can bully small ones. Whoa. How about that? Big nations can bully small ones? I'm glad I don't live in a country where it doesn't invade Iraq and Afghanistan and Pakistan and Somalia. I'm glad I don't live in a country that, destroyed democracy in Guatemala, Iran, Brazil, invaded the Dominican Republic, Laos, Cambodia, etc., Chile. The list goes on and on. I mean, again, it's amazing how these kinds of things can not only be enunciated, but are not commented on, are simply not commented on. David Brooks, writing in the New York Times, or Thomas Friedman, or, the endless guests that Charlie Rose has on, representing power mostly. They don't see these kinds of contradictions. It takes a very disciplined intellectual class not to see these things, and they are disciplined. So when Hillary Clinton, during the Tahrir Square demonstrations in Egypt, when she said at the height of those demonstrations in 2011, she announced to the assembled press corps that no country in the world has done more for democracy in Egypt than the United States of America. And nobody, there were no paroxysms of laughter. There was no one, shouting out, saying, "Are you kidding me?" I mean, do you think we're all idiots out here? We know the record of the United States supporting Hosni Mubarak's dictatorship for 30 years. I mean, again, it's simply astonishing that the press corps or press corps, does not call these people out when they make, outrageous comments. Like Kerry goes on and on, like a monochromatic one-note samba about respect for international law. In the Ukraine, that Russia must respect sovereignty. As Chomsky says in this book, Power Systems, for laws to be, as a matter of logic, principles cannot be selectively applied. They have to be across the board. So you can't advocate, let's say in the case of the Ukraine, sovereignty and international law and the UN Charter, and in other areas completely ignore it. And that's why outside the United States, people see the policy contradictions here much more in greater relief, because it is so obvious, and it is reported on quite steadily. Even in Canada, you don't have to go that far away. Although, are there any Canadians in the audience before I light into Stephen Harper? He is George W. Bush on steroids. We may think that, things are bad in the US, and they are. Well, it's much worse in Canada in many respects. Harper is a fundamentalist, born again, who believes that the resources in the earth must be extracted because otherwise God wouldn't have put them there for us. And 75% of all of the major mining corporations in the world are headquartered in Canada. That's astonishing when you think about it. I mean, California has as many people as all of Canada, 35 million. So this country of 35 million is the home to 75% of the world's major mining corporations, who are wrecking the environment in Latin America, in Central America, in Africa, in Papua New Guinea, wherever. Just do a Google search, Canadian mining companies and human rights violations, and you'll just get a plethora of reports that have come out over the last couple of years. Now, this chutzpah of power and arrogance, exemplified. I'm not just picking on Obama. We all like Obama. He speaks English, which is, great after Bush. But no, I think quite seriously, in 2008, a lot of people were attracted to someone who could speak proper English. After 8 years of and duh, people were happy to hear someone who had command of the language. But one of the many things I learned from Chomsky is in The City of God. It's written by St. Augustine. See, I can't do all of this research, so Noam is like the Encyclopedia Britannica. So he brought this to my attention and other people's attention. This is what this story, St. Augustine tells the story of a pirate captured by Alexander the Great. The emperor angrily demanded of the pirate, "How dare you molest the seas?" To which the pirate replied, "How dare you molest the whole world? Because I do it with a small boat, I am called a pirate and a thief. You with a great navy molest the world and are called an emperor." And St. Augustine thought that the pirate's answer was, quote, elegant and excellent. Courage. We need courage as shown by an 84-year-old nun, Sister Megan Rice, who was just sentenced a couple of days ago. Well, today's Wednesday. Yesterday, she was sentenced to a 35-month jail term for breaking into a U.S. Nuclear weapons plant, along with two co-defendants, Greg Obaid, 58 years old, and Michael Wally, 64, who both received 62-month sentences for protesting the ongoing nuclear arms race. So there are people out there who do take risks, who care enough about society to literally go to jail. People like Sandra Steingraber, who's the Rachel Carson of this era, recently spent a couple of weeks in a jail in upstate New York opposing fracking, which is a huge issue there. The Marsalis Basin has had an enormous amount of problems with the aquifer being contaminated. There's been incidents of seismic activity where there had never been seismic activity before. She's an extraordinary woman that everyone should know about, Sandra Steingraber. To do independent media is, I think, it's very invigorating, it's very liberating, it's a lot of fun. But it's also really hard because of the political climate in the country, which is so conservative now. I mean, there's been such a shift to the right. And I'm not talking about, decriminalizing marijuana and, gay marriage. And there's been certain breakthroughs on social issues. But if someone like Dwight D. Eisenhower, came on the political scene today, he would be regarded as a wild-eyed radical. He would have not only no place in the Republican Party, the Democrats would reject him as a complete, loony. Someone who warned the country about the military-industrial complex, who said that every penny spent on militarism and weapons was a theft from hungry children and from people who needed housing and to be clothed. That's how far the country has moved to the right in the last 40 or 50 years. I mean, there has been some good things as well. In terms of NPR and PBS, their funding has been largely cut. Two things happened. So to understand why they are the way they are. Why do they keep going to the same golden Rolodex of, former Assistant Secretary of States and retired Major Generals? Because, that's where the funding is coming from. The PBS is more like the Petroleum Broadcasting Service today, with funding from ExxonMobil, from Chevron, and they have these, and again, the chutzpah is mind-boggling. BP, after the Gulf spill, was taking ad after ad on PBS saying how green it was, that it cared about the environment, people are happy, and then they'd have these paid informants saying, wow, the water's cleaner now than ever before. It's the same kind of garbage we're seeing in Colorado almost every night on TV. Colorado has a huge wave of fracking going on right now, particularly in some very pristine areas in the Roaring Fork Valley, if you know that area, in the Arkansas Valley. Ads with, farmers cheerful farmers saying, the water's never tasted so good. The air has never been sweeter. Our land is rich and fertile. We love, what fracking is doing for us. So, there is a systematic campaign. Let's call it what it is. It's propaganda. It's to manufacture consent so that, this practice of fracking, which is injecting huge amounts, up to 500 chemicals at very high speeds, along with enormous amounts of fresh water, into shale rock, breaking it open in order to extract natural gas. And it's having huge consequences. I think most of you, or some of you, may have heard of the film Gasland, where there's this famous moment where a farmer turns on a tap and it explodes. It goes on fire. Well, that's happening in more and more places. So with NPR, PBS, the attack, they've succumbed to the attack. And so what's happened to programs like alternative radio? Like I used to be AR used to be on KQED, all right? Maybe many of you still listen to KQED. It has a huge signal all the way down to, to Monterey, way past San Jose, out east towards Sacramento, north to Santa Rosa, even into Mendocino. 6-7 years ago, they took alternative radio off the air. I'm glad to be on KLW, but they have a very small signal. Like where I've just been coming from, Los Altos and San Jose, it barely reaches that area. So other major NPR stations have become more and more timid. That's the word I want to use. They really won't break out of this narrow spectrum of like A to B official opinion. They won't go to A to Z. That's way too radical. So you never hear. Why isn't Chomsky, our most highly regarded intellectual dissident, why isn't he on Charlie Rose, let's say, as much as Henry Kissinger and Thomas Friedman are on? I'm not saying take them off. Rose seems to have a love affair with both of them and is, very obsequious and very milquetoastish when it comes to talking to them. Why don't we hear dissident voices on our public media? I think that's, and I think it's a question that we need to ask. So there's this, of course, T-shirt, which Paul very kindly gave me the last time I was here. Unfortunately, things have gotten worse in terms of an out-of-control rogue Supreme Court at this time. This was, of course, about Citizens United in January 2010, which kind of opened the floodgates to corporate money into the political candidates' coffers. That has now been, they've ramped that up with the recent McCutcheon versus the Federal Election Commission, which has been referred to as Citizens United REDE. It throws out aggregate limits on individual contributions in a single 2-year cycle, saying they violate free speech. This is the great contribution of the United States Supreme Court, that money is free speech, that corporations are human beings. And, we've got to fight that fight. There's a move to amend movement in the country to reverse these court decisions, but I don't know that we have that amount of time to wait for that to happen, because it's so difficult to get, 37 states to approve of for a constitutional amendment to be enacted. Very, very difficult. Will take an enormous amount of time. Meanwhile, the whole political system is coming from Colorado, going to pot. I wish it were going to pot, by the way, that kind of pot, the marijuana pot. Maybe there'd be some enlightenment with a little mind-altering herbal injections. And it was good. I mean, one of the good things that happened in Colorado in the last election, and also in Washington State, was the decriminalization of marijuana. And, maybe it'll do something to reverse the insane drug war that this country's been carrying out since Nixon declared it in the early 1970s, which have filled our jails and prisons with, 2.3 million people. We have more, not just prisoners, we have more executions than any other country. There's way beyond, those horrible dictatorships that we are happy to denounce, like North Korea and Syria and Iran and China. The drug war has been basically a race war. There's no two ways around it. It has been an enormous attack on people of color. You see that in the disparity in the sentencing of crack cocaine versus white cocaine. It's in some instances it's 100 to 1. Holder and Obama recently have reduced that to their credit, but it's still way out of whack. Now, I'm going to have to keep going here a little bit because I want to get back to the environmental questions that are so important. I mean, this is from yesterday's New York Times, and from the science section. Every Tuesday they publish a section on science. It has very good information. Again, science, you can't fudge data in science. It's not like the humanities. It's not something that can be worked. You have to stick to the facts. Otherwise you'll be called out on it. And this is a piece in the Times, to their credit, reporting that scientists say new research concluding that some giant glaciers had passed the point of no return, possibly setting off a chain reaction that could doom the rest of the ice sheet. Furthest along in melting are in the high mountain regions of the Andes, the Alps, the Himalayas, and in Alaska. Well, you don't even have to go to those places. Take my word for it. I'm not a glaciologist, but in Boulder, Colorado, I can see the Arapaho Glacier. I moved to Colorado in 1978. Let's say it was this wide. Now with the naked eye, you can see it's this wide. And when I did go to Nepal and Pakistan and India and along the Himalayas, people were telling me that, they were farmers in particular, because they depend on the snowmelt for irrigation water. They're telling me that the glaciers are much smaller, and they describe how big they were at one time and how much water they used to get and depend on. This is going to be the looming crisis in the 21st century. There was a World Bank vice president, I hate to quote from the World Bank, but every once in a while, kind of law of averages, they say something that's right. His name was Ismail Sarageldin from Malaysia. He said the wars of the 21st century are going to be about water. You can already see tensions in our own Southwest. Arizona, Nevada, California, Colorado, who has water, who's going to get water, who will have green golf courses, who will have, arid land. Those kinds of things are, I think, going to become more and more common as climate change continues and temperatures continue to rise, sea levels continue to rise, and there'll be more and more extreme weather, tornadoes here, and other events, extreme rains, enormous downpours, and then no rain whatsoever. And we saw that, as I mentioned, in Colorado last year, where the drought started, and we had this, incredible flood, and then back to drought again, and no rain whatsoever, or very little rain whatsoever. One of the interesting things that was brought to my attention was this document. Human beings in the natural world are on a collision course. Human activities inflict harsh and often irreversible damage on the environment and on critical resources. If not checked, many of our current practices put at serious risk the future that we wish for human society and the plant and animal kingdoms, and may so alter the living world that it will be unable to sustain life in the manner that we know. Fundamental changes are urgent if we are to avoid the collision our present course will bring about. Does anyone recognize these words? 1992, world scientists warning to humanity. 670 scientists, including 104 Nobel laureates, issued this declaration, and it was already clear to them what was happening to the environment. What we must do, there's a couple of suggestions here. We must bring environmentally damaging activities under control to restore and protect the integrity of the Earth's systems we depend on. We must, for example, move away from fossil fuels to more benign, inexhaustible energy sources to cut greenhouse gas emissions and the pollution of our air and water. I mean, we live in the West. We have abundant sunshine. We have abundant, at least in Colorado, lots of wind that could be used to produce, and to be sustainable sources, alternatives to fossil fuels. Priority must be given to these other energy sources. We must halt deforestation, injury to and loss of agricultural land. I think there's a major crisis in the Central Valley of California right now because of water shortages. We must manage resources crucial to human welfare more effectively, giving high priority to efficient use of energy, water, and other materials, including expansion of conservation. Now, the corporations will tell you, well, there's nothing really to worry about. These are, things that something will happen. There'll be some miracle cure, like they've been trying to come up with a cure for cancer for the last 50 or 60 years, but have been unable to so far. We're to depend on the polluters for their benign intent. They're going to produce something that is going to get us out of the downward spiral that the planet is in. So slowly, the sea levels will rise, and, you won't feel much, I won't feel much in Colorado, but, first it'll be the Maldives and the Seychelles, and then the Marshall Islands and Nauru, and then maybe Sri Lanka, and then Bangladesh is very, very vulnerable. But recently there was a report that of all the U.S. Cities that are in danger, Miami is the most prominent in terms of being engulfed by rising sea levels. The issue of the Marshall Islands and Nauru, by the way, I can't resist saying this, it's kind of shows my frustration as a stand-up comic. This will have serious repercussions to U.S. foreign policy, where in the General Assembly in the UN, when the United States is condemned for supporting settlements, let's say in Palestine or some other activity, that they could always count on the Marshall Islands and Nauru to be in that 184-4 vote or 186-4. Well, they might lose 2 of their votes. That could have really bad repercussions for them. I know I don't see any South Asians in the audience except my comrade Balaji in the back there. I'm going to switch gears again and just tell you a little bit about this man who was just selected as Prime Minister of the world's largest democracy, India, Narendra Modi. Incidentally, I was kicked out of India 3 years ago because of my work on Kashmir and other issues, and I haven't been allowed in the country since. This man is can you imagine if a president of the United States was revealed to be a card-carrying member of the Ku Klux Klan? Well, he's the card-carrying member of an organization called the RSS. It's known by this acronym, the Rashtriya Swayam Sevak Sangh, an extreme right-wing militant political group who takes claim with pride of the assassination. Their members assassinated Mahatma Gandhi in 1948. He was chief minister of the state of Gujarat in Western India in the year 2002 when there was a systematic massacre, a pogrom of Muslims. Anywhere from 1,000 to 2,000 Muslims were killed while he was prime minister. He claims that he knew nothing about it and was not responsible, but all reports on the ground showed without question that the rioters, mostly Hindu rioters, had printouts of where Muslims lived and were going house to house, avoiding the Hindu houses or the Hindu businesses and targeting the Muslim businesses and shops and things like that. And there was horror after horror happened there. And Arundhati Roy has been very prominent in talking about this particular issue and constantly reminding Indians and people of the world, that this guy who's a great friend of corporations and neoliberal economics, he promises to open up India to foreign investment. This is all music to the ears of the people who are well, the Washington consensus that believes in neoliberalism. Well, staying with India for a moment, I think it's important, and I am gradually winding down, I think it's important never to forget art and poetry. And, there are many things we want to be proud of in the United States. I don't want to be proud of being in a country where we just launched a $3 billion most expensive destroyer in the history of the world, the Zumwalt, it's called, and 2 more are on the drawing board. I don't want to be proud about that, or the newly christened Ford aircraft carrier, which is coming in at a price tag of $13 billion. I come from a state where teachers have lost jobs, schools have been closed. The teachers who are teaching in schools are forced to teach 30, 35, 40 students because of consolidation. There's been a huge attack on the public sector, on the safety net, and we need that money that's being drawn into sucked into that vortex, which is the Pentagon, which is a cash cow for Northrop Grumman, for Lockheed Martin, for Raytheon, for Honeywell, for United Technologies, for all of these corporations that make money hand over fist because there is conflict. There's almost an institutional drive in the system to engage militarily around the world. And so that's why the U.S. has 737 military bases and installations around the world. Other countries, like Russia, you know how many bases Russia has? Russia's a very big landmass, by the way. How many bases Russia has outside of Russia? 2. One in Syria, which is under attack, and the other one was actually Sevastopol in Crimea. That's all. Now, when Russia or Iran, let's take Iran, for example. They take interest in neighboring Iraq. There's enormous, chaos there, largely precipitated by the insane criminal invasion of that country in 2003. When Iran takes some interest in what's going on in their neighboring country, that's called meddling by Washington. They're interfering in the internal affairs of the Iraqis, or in neighboring Afghanistan, right on their border. If they take some interest, that shows you they're asserting themselves. They use these exact words. But when Washington creates this massive empire of bases, that's not considered meddling or intervening. It's some kind of divine right. And if you read Obama's speech at the UN last September, you'll read the words over and over again about America's unique position in the world, that is indispensable, that it's the only one that can protect freedom and preserve the peace and security of the world. So, I want to be proud. The things that I'm proud of in this country are rock and roll, are our mountains, our rivers, great poetry, Allen Ginsberg. There's so many wonderful things, but we also have the other side, the dark side, and there's this constant conflict between the two. Now, I come from Boulder, Colorado, as you know, and the Naropa Institute is located there. It was founded by Allen Ginsberg and Anne Waldman. Many West Coast poets have come to Boulder over the years, people like Lawrence Ferlinghetti of City Lights, Gregory Corso, Gary Snyder, and many others. And they're celebrating the 40th anniversary of Naropa this year. If they have a poetry reading, and if 60 or 70 people show up, they're absolutely thrilled. They say, wow, look at the interest that people in Boulder have for poetry. There's so much sophistication here that they turn out and support poetry. Well, I spent lots of time in Pakistan and India, and instead of 60 or 70 people turning out at poetry readings, it's more like 60 or 70,000. Because poetry is very, very important. It's a living tradition in that culture. And the greatest Urdu poet of the 20th century is Faiz Ahmed Faiz. He was born in Sialkot, Punjab in 1911. He died in Lahore, Pakistan in 1984. He was a trade unionist and proud of it. He was a communist and proud of it. He was a labor organizer. He was a radical, and he was a great, great poet. And he was jailed during the military dictatorship of Ayub Khan in the 1950s that the United States, backed to the hilt. That little piece of information has gone down the memory hole. There's been a whole succession of military dictators in Pakistan that the United States has supported very fervently. Well, he's got a couple of great poems, and when they have these poetry readings, by the way, the audiences are usually so in tune with the poet that when the poet says the first line, the audience says the second line. That's how hip people are to this oral tradition. And one of his most radical poems is called Hum Dekenge, which means we shall see. And it's sung, it's recited in demonstrations, all kinds of protests, as well as in poetry readings. Hum dekenge lazim hai ki hum bhi dekenge. We shall see the day that has been promised, of which has been written on the slate of eternity, when enormous mountains of tyranny come tumbling down and blow away like cotton, when the earth will pulsate, and on the heads of our rulers, when lightning will strike, when the crowns will be tossed, when the thrones will be brought down. Hum dekenge, we shall see that day when tyranny is ended. Perhaps his most famous poem is called Bol, B-O-L. Now you know a word in Hindi and in Urdu. It's the imperative to speak. And again, this is recited at demonstrations. You see placards in Hindi and as well as in Urdu saying these three letters, B-O-L, Bol. Bol ke lab azad hai tere. Speak, your lips are free. Speak, your tongue is still yours. This magnificent body is still yours. Speak, your life is still yours. Speak, there is little time, but little though it is enough time, enough before the body perishes, before the tongue atrophies. Speak, the truth still lives. Say what you have to say. Speak, your lips are free. Bol. Thank you very much. And I think, particularly for people here who have children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren perhaps, thinking about the future, what kind of legacy are we going to leave for them? We're like, in a way, we're kind of like the Great Gatsby. They made a mess of things, they were careless, they threw things around, and then they left it for other people to clean up. Well, we've made quite a mess of things, and we haven't been good stewards of our earth, of Mother Nature. We haven't been careful, we haven't been prudent, we haven't been caring and loving. The way, maybe many of you have pets, right? You have plants, you have gardens, you take care of them, you nurture them, you give them water, you pet them, you make sure they get enough sunlight or shade or whatever that's required. So surely we know we have that capacity, but it has to be magnified dramatically. And I don't think we have time on our side. Well, about this question of optimism and being depressed, I like to quote Eduardo Galeano, the great Uruguayan novel, who says, save despair and depression for better times. When things turn around, and we've moved the Titanic in the other direction, maybe we can indulge ourselves in feeling despair and depression. But I don't think we have that. That would be an indulgence at this time. We have to act. We have to do something. We can't let this continue down the path that we're on, which will inevitably lead to enormous destruction and dislocation. And, there'll still be life on the planet, but it will not be as we know it. There was a New Yorker cartoon that Michael Parenti brought to my attention a couple of years ago of some CEO of some major corporation, addressing a group of stockholders in some ballroom in a hotel in New York, and they were all like clamoring, we want more dividends, we want to see more profits, and he's saying, calm down now, then he acknowledges the long-term prospects for the planet are very grim indeed. But in the short term, we're going to make a financial killing. And everybody jumps up on their feet and gives him a standing ovation. There's even an acknowledgement of this, because this is in the DNA of the capitalist economic system. There is a constant desire, a constant, almost mechanical ability to metastasize. We are in the cancer stage of capitalism now. The tumor is metastasizing, and we're eating the host being the planet.